Hi, I'm Ems, aka on Dark and Wings. In this video I'll be showing you how I paint Judge Dredd miniatures. Joking aside, Games Workshop actually did publish a Judge Dredd RPG book back in the 80s. Before Warhammer became GW's big focus, they used to do other franchises. Hence why there's a lot of overlap in the Warhammer miniatures with influences from other franchises. So waffle aside, you'll want to start by priming the model in black because there's mainly black armour. Just be aware that not all black paints are the same, they have different shades, so if you're using a rattle can to prime it, it might be different from the paint you use if you need to do any corrections, if that bothers you at all. It might be worth just painting back over it with a black paint once you've primed it in the black spray paint, it's completely up to you. So starting off with the armour, since that's the main areas, I know a lot of people would use grey to highlight black. The thing with black though is, it can be a very reflective surface, so you could highlight it with anything really if you wanted to, but there are some colours which look interesting rather than using greys. So I like to personally use blues and greens, so these types of shades. It just changes it up a bit from just using grey, and you could always use a mixture of greys and then use some blue on some different areas if you're painting something a bit more intricate which had a lot of black on it. So I'm mixing some Thunderhawk blue with some black. Instead of that combination of Thunderhawk and black, I could use Ink by Darkness instead if I wanted to, because that is like an off black colour, which is kind of what I'm going for. So I'm adding some highlights now with that mixture of Thunderhawk and black. You can dry brush this on instead if you want to. I'm probably assuming you know what dry brushing is, if not, it's worth just having a YouTube, it's a really quick way of painting. This colour might be difficult to see on camera building up because it's quite dark, but it'll be a subtle transition as I build up the highlights. I personally like building up my highlights over time, as if you just pick a bright colour to highlight straight away, it looks a bit too jarring in my opinion. So you get the gist of what I'm going for here. I'm adding some highlights but still keeping some of that black showing from previously. So next up I'm just adding Thunderhawk blue on its own. So the more highlights that you add, the less areas we're going to cover. Once again, feel free to just dry brush this on if you want to, but the same principle applies, add less paint to less areas, the more highlights that you add. If you do struggle with small edges and areas painting them on models, you can add a flow aid additive. This isn't the same as a thinning medium like a lamium medium. It doesn't just thin your paints down, it actually changes the consistency of the paint so it flows off the brush much easier. Usually when you're painting smaller areas you're using a smaller brush and the paint dries up quicker, but this stuff makes it flow off the brush much easier, and I think I'll do a video just explaining it in more detail, but it's worth having a search for the product and other people using it in the meantime. It's pretty subtle, the colour changes on this dark miniature, but you can start to see the highlights popping through now, and I think it looks a bit more interesting than just using black and grey, and I think it kind of has this neon look to it, which you would probably find in the city streets of Necromunda and Hive worlds. You would be probably perfectly fine leaving it there if you wanted to, but if you would just want to push it that bit more, you could add some more highlights. So I'm mixing that Thunderhawk blue in with some Phoenician grey. To ease the transitions of the highlights, as I mentioned before, I like to add a bit of the previous colour in with the next highlight. So rather than just use the Phoenician grey on its own right away, I add that bit of Thunderhawk blue in. I'm just adding a few highlights, and the simple thing, as I said before, the more highlights you add, the less areas you want to cover, and just reinforcing some previous ones. After these highlights are done, I went back in with some Phoenician grey and just went on some very small areas for some highlight, but I did this off camera as it cut out, but you get the principle. Moving away from the armour now onto the gun, I'm using Burnt Red from Pro-Arcyl, a fantastic range of paints. The equivalent to this would be like a corn red, so like a deeper red. So this is just going all over the weapon, it's that simple basically. If you haven't worked with pro-acryl before, I do have a video reviewing them, I can't recommend them enough. So next up, I'm using a mahogany from Pro-Arcyl. And whilst the gun's drying, I'm going to be painting the pouches. So there's a couple little pouches and a gun pouch on this model. You can use whatever other brand that you want to. I'm using the Rosemary & Co. Series 33 size 0 brush if you're curious. That's what I'm using for pretty much all of this model. I personally like painting other areas whilst other parts are drying, so I'm going over the metallic silver area, so grab whatever silver you want to. Although I am using some Darkstar Molten Metal silver here, and I highly recommend this brand. I have a video reviewing them as well, and just because they sent me a review copy doesn't mean I'm prejudiced. I just think it's a great brand of paints to get. I just think true metallics are so much easier to work with than doing non-metallic metal all the time, and I think they look great, to be honest. Next up is that gold shoulder pad, which is very regal, so I'm painting that in royal gold from Darkstar Molten Metals. This is probably one of my absolute favourite paints of all time. I'll actually go get some of this paint. The coverage is mega and it shines so well. Also, whilst the red paint is dried on the gun, I went back over and there's a little Aquila type eagle on that as well, so I covered that part. As well as doing his belt buckle, I always think it's good to add a little pop of the same colour which you've used throughout the model, just to add some contrast and make it a bit more interesting and tie it together. So there's a little bit of flesh poking out with his face and chin, which I'm going to be doing a tan flesh with this pinky colour from Pro-Arcyl. Grab whichever flesh tone that you want to here. If you ever do make any mistakes, since in this part I'm using a small area, so it's more likely I'm going to make a mistake, just get a brush with some water on and wipe away that excess and it'll clean it off straight away. So grabbing a bone colour here, I'm using this one for Pro-Arcyl, so this bright ivory. There's a small puberty seal on this model, so it's going on that. And then I'm going to be painting a stripe on the helmet too. Another thing with neatness and painting small areas is brush control, so not having too much paint on your brush, making sure it's thinned enough but not thin too much where it's too watery and it'll just go everywhere. But it's just a case of practice, and again I think it's probably a video it's worth me making, talking about brush control and thinning paints down for smaller areas like this. So here I'm starting to add some washes to create some more depth, so grab some nun oil or whatever other black wash you have. So we are shading the silver areas, the red areas as well, and any areas where the leather is. I'm also going to add some wash to the armour, just to put some shadows back into it, and it also tidies up the areas so the highlights kind of blend more together, if that makes sense. So they'll all have that one cover of black over the top of them. You don't have to do this, but I think it just kind of makes it look a bit better. So I'm grabbing some tan flesh again here because it's already on my palette, and what I'm doing is I'm adding this to my mahogany brown to create some highlights on the pouch areas. So you don't need to add white to highlight things or grab a lighter version of that colour. You can use other colours as well to highlight with. Flesh tones look really good, I think, when highlighting browns and reds. So again, that flow aid has come in handy here. It makes it a lot easier to add edge highlights and paint small details. And I'm just adding some artificial sort of textured looks here. Instead of using orange to highlight the red, I mixed that tan flesh in with the previous red that I've used on the gun. It creates this kind of peachy tone. This is a great way to highlight red without making it look orange. Plus, if you added white to the red, it would look too pink, whereas this is a bit more subtle. Remember to use the edge of your brush where you can when you're doing highlights. It makes life a lot easier. Also, just add in a little bit of a highlight to the purity seal and to the lens, which I also painted in red. If you then want to make those highlights a bit more subtle, what you can do is thin down some red to like a glaze consistency, so like a wash almost, and then put it over the top of the highlights, and that'll uniform it a bit more and look more red. And this can be done for any other colours, but especially it looks better with red. Red's quite transparent, so the more highlights you add, the more desaturated it looks, so this kind of ties it all back together. Now I'm going to be shading the gold areas and some other parts, so I'm using Contrast Gilliman's Flesh. I'm thinning this down to more of a wash consistency. You could use something like a Rykel and Flesh shade or anything similar. So flesh washes like this, these warm tones make the gold pop really nicely. I'm going to be using this on the area of the face which is showing, and also over the purity seal. You could just use another shade or tone if you want to on the purity seal, but just for quick I'm using this. And the shade's going over all those little areas I painted in gold as well, like on the gun and the belt. Pick whatever you like for the base. I'm going with a Dawnstone, and this is, sorry, it looks kind of like some sort of dystopian kind of pavement look. I do really appreciate that the bases are now textured that GW release, so it kind of gives that a little bit more detail to them if you don't want to add too much and be a bit lazy. And here's the avatar pretty much finished now. If you'd like to know how I made the backdrop, I've got another video in the description below. As always, thank you for watching. Remember to enjoy your hobbies for yourself, respect the people who enjoy them in their own ways, and at the end of the day, they're just war dollies. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.